My name is Fiona Steil-Antoni, and today we are going to be looking at all of Black's possible responses against 1d4, starting with the worst and working our way up to the best. So without further ado, let's jump in and begin with Black's worst possible response. Can you guess it? That move is 1g5, the so-called Borg. Why is it called the Borg? Because it is the Grob in reverse. However, the Borg is a lot worse than the Grob. Why is that? Because the pawn on g5 is simply hanging. White can capture the pawn, and look at Black's position. No pieces developed, a pawn down. This is a complete disaster. White is just going to continue with natural moves, taking the center, developing pieces, and this position is borderline winning already for White, so the Borg, stay away from it. In the same tier list of worst possible responses, we have h5. h5, why do you not want to play h5? Because you don't want to play on the side of the board in the opening. Especially here, h5 very often has the idea of getting the rook out, but that is not possible if White responds with e4, and e4 is a move I will always advise you to play against any move that Black plays on the side of the board. When Black plays on the side, you want to respond in the center. Here Black cannot even do their rook lift because we will simply take the rook. So h5, much like g5, stay away from it. Next up, against d4, we have f6. What does Ben Feingold say? Never play f6. That's maybe not quite always true, but certainly so in the starting position. f6 is a terrible move. It removes the natural developing square of the knight from g8. It also opens up your king on the light square, so f6 is just a terrible move again. White will simply respond by taking the center, developing the pieces, and this is a fantastic position for White. So f6, do not try it at home. Next up, in the bottom tier list, we have one a5. Much like h5, a5 does nothing to fight for the center, does not develop any piece. And once again, if White responds with the natural e4, you cannot play rook a6 because that rook will be captured. So a5, I'm not gonna say anything more about it. All White needs to do is play normal developing moves and they will have a great position. Now the final move in the bottom tier list is h6. Again, h6 does nothing to fight for the center, does not develop any pieces, maybe not quite as bad as h5, but still after normal developing moves from White, they will get a great position. So let's move on to the next category of moves. Not quite as bad as the ones we've just seen, but not recommended either. We will start with one knight a6. Knight a6, yes, it develops a piece, but it develops it to the edge of the board. And as we say, the knight on the rim is dim or grim. Again, after e4, White is just grabbing the center. The knight cannot even jump into c5. And after normal developing moves, White gets a great position here. So knight a6, don't play it. Also, don't play the move on the other side of the board. Knight h6, equally as bad as knight a6, to be honest. Again, this move, yes, it develops a piece, but it does not fight for the center. One thing I will say here, if you're White, I would not advise you to capture the knight, because yes, Black gets this pawn weakness, but White has given up the bishop pair, so probably it makes more sense to just ignore this knight, play e4, take away the square, and then, as always, just develop your pieces, two natural squares, fight for the center, and life is good here. Now let's move on to the next one. The next one, I would say, not quite as bad. It is e5, the Englund gambit. The Englund gambit has actually been played by some very strong players, for example, by Grandmaster Daniel Duboff, by Andrew Tang, or also by a man Hambleton of Chess.com fame, who's actually done a lot for the popularization of the Englund gambit. Yes, White can take a pawn, but there's actually quite a bit of theory here. The main line continues with knight c6. Now White defends the pawn on e5, but Black goes queen e7, bringing one more attacker. And here, in general, White refrains from holding on to the pawn. Instead, they often continue with knight c3. And here, Black recaptures the pawn on e5. And yes, Black has regained their pawn. However, we should not capture here. That would only help black to get the queen active. The main move is not the king, but the main move is e4. And now white is saying, yes, material is even, but what is your queen doing on e7? It's just blocking in your own pieces, so this is a great position for white. However, the Englund gambit, not to be underestimated and something you can definitely look into if you want to surprise your opponents. Now, next up, we've got the so-called the St. George opening. Is quite a rare guest. However, it is to be noted that if white responds with e4, we have actually transposed to a position here that has been played on the white side by Anatoly Karpov against Anthony Miles. Anthony Miles played in a game against Karpov, won a6 and famously beat him in this opening. So a6 is a move that does not damage your position so much. However, it also does nothing to fight in the center. You can try it as a once-off, but again, white will simply respond with natural developing moves, taking the center, and so on and so forth. Now let's move on to the next tier of moves. We're getting, better and better. a6, what was a6 doing? Among other things, it was preparing b5. So if you want to play b5, why not just play it immediately? b5 is the so-called Polish opening. And the idea here, of course, is that black wants to develop the bishop to b7. One thing to be noted, you don't generally want to take the pawn on b5 because your pawn on e4 is hanging as well. So black would be quite happy to trade one of their side pawns for one of your central pawns. Instead, after bishop b7, you can simply play bishop d3, defending the pawn on e4, and then you will continue with natural developing moves. And once again, it's not entirely clear what this pawn is doing on b5 here, so life is good. The next response by black is knight c6. Knight c6, the so-called Mikenas variation, is actually a move that I have tried myself as black. It is a bit reminiscent of its cousin, the Alekhine defense, e4 knight f6. However, there are some differences, of course, here in the Mikenas. There is a lot of ways in which white can respond to knight c6. One normal move is knight f3, just overprotecting the pawn, developing a piece. c4 is also a move. However, d5 is the move that is most reminiscent of the Alekhine, chasing the knight away, taking the center, and then potentially following this up with f4, kicking the knight away further. So the Mikenas, you can try this at home, I would say, but you have to know what you're doing. And as white, it's certainly nothing to be afraid of. Next one is d4 b6. b6, the so-called English opening, not to be confused with what most people will know as the English opening, one c4. Against b6, once again, very similar to what we said against b4, we want to take the center, we will defend our center, protect our center, then we will develop our pieces. And again, life is good here because black is not really fighting for the center just yet. And again, this is a playable opening from the black side. So let's move on to the next one. The next one, response to d4, is c5. c5 is the Old Benoni. Why? Well, we will see why. If white responds with d5, after knight f6, c4, we're back in the mainline Benoni here. However, after d5, black can also try e5 here, and there's a lot of different lines. One thing that is important to note about c5, the Old Benoni, is that the pawn on c5 is not actually hanging. If white captures, if black would like to win the pawn back, they can do so immediately by checking our king and recapturing the pawn on c5 on the next move. So that is it for the basis of the Old Benoni c5. The next response is d6. d6 is the rat, or rather, after c4, e5, this is the actual rat opening, which has been played, among others, by world champion Magnus Carlsen, so not to be underestimated. I have also tried d6 myself. Again, like with a lot of other moves, there are possible transpositions here. If white now plays e4, black has to be ready to play a Pirz or maybe a Philidor by following up with e5 later on. So a lot of possible options here for both sides. White does not have to respond with e4, they can also go c4, they can go knight f3, and then there's a lot of possible setups that black can go for here, as well as white. d6, a playable move, at least black has finally played a move in the center and is fighting for that central control. Next up, we've got d4, c6. And you're wondering, what is c6? What is black doing? Do they just want to transpose to a Caro-Kann? Do they want to entice you into playing e4? It's not so clear. However, c6 is a playable move. Again, if white continues with c4, we will transpose into some Slavs. So c6, not a terrible move. It's not such a big deal that it takes away the square from the knight, as black will continue by playing in the center. Now let's move on to the next one, f5, the so-called Dutch. A very ambitious opening choice by black. Yes, this king gets exposed a little bit along the light squares, but black is immediately fighting for the center here. For once, we can't really go e4. The Dutch has been played by some very strong players, among others by Hikaru Nakamura, who has played the Dutch on numerous occasions. Magnus Carlsen has tried it, and even Botvinnik played it in his World Championship matches. The Dutch is really quite a serious opening. There's a number of ways in which white can react, and there's also a number of ways in which black can play the Dutch. They can here, after c4, knight c3 by white, they can go for the Leningrad Dutch, where the bishop will be developed to g7, or they can play with e6, playing a classical Dutch, where most often the bishop will come to e7. After the Dutch, black can also play a stonewall setup. So f5, I would say you can very much try this at home. Look up some games by Hikaru, by other players who have played the Dutch with a lot of success, and have fun with it. Next up, we've got g6. g6, it is a modern, especially if white now goes for e4, then black will play a modern, maybe a Pirc. However, if white doesn't go for e4, goes for c4, once again, there's a lot of flexibility here for black. We could transpose to a Grunfeld, to a King's Indian. We will see what those openings are a bit later, but g6, a perfectly fine move for black, indicating that they want to develop their bishop to g7 and then fight in the center later on. A similar move in the same tier list is e6. e6, once again, a lot of flexibility here. This is the so-called Horwitz system, and a lot of things can happen here. For starters, once again, white can play e4 and transpose into a French. So if you want to try e6, you have to be prepared for that. You might have to play French as black. So again, e6, a very flexible move, a perfectly fine move for black. But now, without further ado, let's move to the top two best responses for black. And in number 2, we have d5. d5, possibly the most solid response against 1 d4, the queen's pawn opening, and a lot of things can happen here. For starters, of course, we have c4, the queen's gambit of Netflix fame. After the queen's gambit, there's a lot of ways, once again, in which black can respond. Maybe the most solid, e6, the queen's gambit declined. Black can also take on c4, the queen's gambit accepted. There is also c6, which will lead to a Slav. So a lot of possible reactions to c4. However, c4 is not the only move for white. White can go knight f3, bishop f4, play a London, which has been all the rage these last few years. They can also go knight c3 and bishop f4, the Jobava London, which has also been very popular. So d5, definitely a solid choice for black, can lead to a lot of different positions, and I very much encourage you to play this at home. For now, let's move to the last move in this video. I'm sure you can guess it already, that move. It is knight f6. I gave you a hint earlier when I said the knight here was not going to the best square, and when we looked at f6, I said that pawn is taking away the developing square of the knight from g8. One interesting fact to know is that 85% of master games that start with d4 actually continue with d5 or knight f6. So those are by far the most common, the most popular and the best responses. After knight f6, there's a lot of flexibility here for black. A lot of openings can happen if white continues with c4. Black can play e6. Once again, this can transpose to some queen's gambit. It can also, however, after knight c3, as we already saw earlier, lead to the Nimzo. If black instead plays b6 to the queen's Indian, if black goes c5, we can have a Benoni. So a lot of ways that this can develop here for both sides, because if after e6, if white plays knight f3, not allowing the Nimzo here after bishop b4 check, this is now a BOGO Indian. So all of these openings starting with knight f6 are part of the Indian family. Now if after c4 black instead continues with g6, once again we are being spoiled for choice here. After bishop g7 we will probably get a king's Indian here, where black will continue with d6, fighting for that central control, trying to get in e5. Black can also play d5, the Grunfeld, one of the most popular, one of the most solid openings on the elite level, across all levels. So many things here that can happen after knight f6. So knight f6, very much. You can try this as black. It is one of the most popular, one that leads to the best results for black. It can lead to so many different openings, so many rich positions. So I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun trying this at home. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do let me know in the comments if you would have ranked the move in the same or in a similar order. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to click that subscribe button, and I will see you in another video very soon.